I am recording. I
There we
am.
go.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's get started. For everyone that's here, we are planning to talk about executive summaries. If you're expecting to talk about something else, you're not in the right place. So that's the topic. We plan to, and let me move to the next slide. This is what we plan to go through. There are three of us here, and we're going to introduce ourselves. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about executive summaries. I've written quite a few in my time and where they fit into the overall ecosystem of the startup world. Kirsten's going to go into a lot of detail about the requirements for the competition itself. She's going to give lots of examples. I'm going to make a brief appearance at the end to just summarize what we should have picked up from this session. We want to make sure that we answer any questions you have. We have reserved some time at the end for questions, but we also want you to feel free to ask questions as we go. So you don't have to keep quiet and save your questions for the end. Feel free to ask them at any time. And then we'll also give you some links to resources you can use to find out more about executive summaries and the overall entrepreneurial scene. So that said, I'd like to move into the introductions, starting with Kirsten. Who has the best photo?
A photo of the night.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, everybody. It's great to meet you. I'm Kirsten Suddeth. I'm currently a general partner with Next Frontier Capital. And right now I'm actually living up in Bozeman, Montana, although I am normally found in Boulder. A little bit about my professional background. Before joining Next Frontier, I was an investor with Blackhorn Ventures. Before that, an entrepreneur in residence with Techstars Boulder. And then kind of chapter one of my career was in and out of different entrepreneurial companies. So I've been part of 4 different companies, for me, always with kind of a ops, finance, or product hat on. And industries that range from clean tech to local food to advertising technology. And then I spent some time at Zayo as well around their IPO. I'm a 2-time buff, big fan of CU. I went an undergrad for philosophy and math and then did an MBA in entrepreneurial finance. And then on the personal side, my husband, Ben, and my daughter, Riley, are actually in Colorado now, visiting some family, driving back tomorrow. Currently living in Bozeman, and we are huge U.S. women's national team soccer fans, and just women's soccer in general. We watch all the games. And then my fun fact of the night is that I used to compete on the Free Skiing World Tour as a competitive big mountain skier.
We're not
Okay,
worthy,
back
Kirsten.
to you, Dave.
We're not worthy. Okay, on to me. I just need to figure out how to change the slide. Okay, so I'm the second person speaking here. I've got a longer career than Kirsten just because I've been around longer. And I'll start from the beginning. After college, I decided I wanted to see the world. So I went to work for a company called Schlumberger, which meant that I was doing surveys and blowing things up in oil wells across North and West Africa. Then I decided that was enjoyable. I got to see the world, but I preferred living and working in the United States. So I came back to the US and got a business school degree, worked for Hewlett Packard for about a dozen years, starting in their PC business and pretty much staying in that part of the business overall, PCs and workstations. And I split my time, even though I wanted to come back to the States, I split my time with Hewlett Packard between the United States and France. The last 6 years I was in France. I was attracted to Colorado by a venture capital firm that recruited me to be part of the founding team of Left Hand Networks, named literally after the brewery in Longmont. And that was very successful, sold to HP. I later became first head of marketing and biz dev and then CEO of an Israeli-funded company called Sanrad. And then 12 years ago, I founded TeamSnap to address the problems that I saw with my son's soccer, or actually lacrosse team. Just as I told my wife, I was an assistant coach, and I just could not believe how inefficient and ineffective and time-consuming everything we were doing was. So I scratched my own itch and found some guys to help me develop the application. I actually sold the company 9 months ago, although I'm still engaged. Education, I was an engineer at the other CU on the East Coast, Cornell, and then I went to Harvard for my MBA. On the personal side, I am delighted that my wife and I have been together for 35 years, and we have 2 adult children. They're both buffs. My son actually recently graduated, and I'm into skiing, although this is why I said not worthy compared to Kirsten. I'm a rank amateur compared to her. I do like cycling as well. I travel a bunch, and living in Europe and Africa definitely helped. I'm into cooking and like to read a lot, and also beer and wine, but craft beers are more interesting because we live in the Napa Valley of beer. And then I've already talked about this, but I've worked quite a bit of my career outside the United States, which I'd recommend if you can do it. You definitely learn a lot living in other cultures and getting other perspectives. And I think it helps me understand better what's going on in our own country. That's it for me. And now to Stan.
So what I've learned tonight is that I should have gone first because this is a really hard act to follow, both of these people. We're super fortunate to have both of them tonight. I mean, they're rock stars in the bowler community, and they're going to have some great insights tonight. I mean, for me, I'm Stan Hickory. I'm the director of the New Venture Challenge. Many of you have already met. If after tonight you've got questions, please feel free to reach out, ask your questions. I am here to help everything NVC, and we're going to have a fantastic year. My fun fact, I've climbed 4 of the 7 summits. I got to do that when I owned an adventure travel company and got to travel all over the world, taking people on big mountains, and really got to see a lot of what this world has to offer. So take it away, guys. Ready for a great night.
Hey, Stan, when you say 7 summits, you mean the highest summit on each continent?
That's correct.
Wow, that is impressive.
Well, it's not all 7, but
I haven't even climbed a 14er yet, so good for you.
All right, we'll put that on our bucket list.
Yep. Okay, good enough. So my turn again. I'm going to talk about executive summaries and provide some context, starting off with what are they for? And I'm going to talk about executive summaries, and Kirsten's going to do the same in a general sense, although we will provide some details about what you should be aiming to do specifically for the NVC competition. So think of an executive summary as a tool, and as you'll see in a subsequent slide, not the only one, but they are a tool to let people know what you're doing. And when I say people, the audiences for the summary are listed here: judges, investors, partners, customers, and even co-founders, people you're trying to attract to the team. The executive summary should be something that allows people to, if they read even just the first page or paragraph, understand what you are up to with your company. And because we are tonight gathered to talk about the NVC, I listed judges first. So because executive summaries are often used for investors, talking to investors, I thought it would be useful, and this goes outside the NVC competition, but I thought it'd be useful to understand, so what different kinds of investors are there? And this slide describes the investor ecosystem. So think of this as the private equity, and that term is often used very specifically, but private equity ecosystem. And just, finance 101 here, private equity, there are kind of 2 ways you get money from people. Either they give you money and expect that money and interest back, that's a loan, or they give you money and they expect that your company will be worth more in the future. That's called equity. And there are 2 kinds of equity, private and public. Public equity is what you see traded in the stock market every day. So we're talking about private equity because none of the companies you guys are founding, and most companies in general, never become public. They're private. And think about this chart as starting from the very smallest, littlest company to potentially the biggest that are candidates for becoming public companies. So think about the spectrum also as describing a risk-reward trade-off. So starting with the left, the smallest companies are typically bootstrapped in the early years. People won't give you money because you don't have a business yet. And you typically need to at least get started with your own efforts and maybe a little bit of your own money. That's called bootstrapping. Some companies have been successful just bootstrapping, and many businesses are not suitable for these other kinds of investments and are forced to do that. But that, for the kinds of companies we're talking about and that we are entertaining for the competition, are potential venture companies, which brings me to the next stage. So in the early days, when you still are just getting rolling, you typically will seek money from what is referred to as angel investors, or competitions like today's, or funds, venture capital funds that invest in very early ventures, and sometimes grants from the government or otherwise. That's the first place, other than just your friends and family and yourself. That's the first place to seek money. And I would imagine that the winners of the NVC will be candidates for an angel or a pre-seed or seed round. After that, you start to get into more traditional venture capital and beyond, which is bigger check sizes, less risk because you've proven your business ideally, and you've got a bright future. And that's when venture capital firms like, for instance, the Foundry Group here in Boulder or Boulder Ventures will get interested. And then lastly, there are a variety of firms that focus on big businesses that have a proven business model, that are successful, that need more money to continue to grow and create value. And private equity firms or growth equity firms are the kinds of firms that write checks in that $10 million range. Same thing with the biggest VCs, who are starting to encroach upon, have been for a few years actually, the private equity space, or strategic partners, which that term, by the way, just means established companies. Like, say, for my company, Nike would be a strategic partner that considered investing, or any established company, could be Nextdoor, something like that. So a way to think about, once again, this spectrum is, in the early days, you're high risk, you don't need a lot of money, and there are folks that are interested in that kind of investment. And then later on, you are a candidate for investment from investors that just will not lose money. And there are all kinds of players in the middle there. Any questions about that before I move on? It's good to understand the spectrum. And when you're talking to a potential investor, it's good to moving things too fast here. It's good to understand their risk reward trade-off, where they like to play, so to speak. Okay. So shifting gears, I'd like to talk about, where does the executive summary fit in telling your story, communicating your plan? And think of it as just one thing. So I've listed here all the different tools, and I've listed a fifth actually that I personally have evolved away from, but let me talk about each one of these. So the first of these is an elevator pitch. This is a 30-second or so description that you should use anytime somebody asks you, what does your company do? And you should not be inventing this on the fly. You should just in general have a quick response. My company does X, Y, and Z for these kinds of customers in these places. And we're different than this, this, and that for this reason. Shouldn't be more than 30 seconds. And it is something that you and ultimately everybody in your company should be able to articulate. The overview blurb is similar to the elevator pitch, except that it is written and it's used for introductions. It's used to describe what you're doing, but in a very short fashion. It should be less than a paragraph, or should be a short paragraph. And it should be something that, and I get this kind of request all the time. Hey, Dave, can you introduce me to this investor? hey, Dave, can you introduce me to this potential partner? And if I'm going to do that, I need a description, right? Hey, Susie, my buddy Bill wants to meet you. He's doing X, Y, and Z. That X, Y, and Z that I'm referring to, that's the overview blurb. And that should be crisp, clear, and most people violate this particular tenet. It shouldn't be too long because humans' attention span is quite brief, especially for if somebody's asking you for something. So it should be just really quick. Today's discussion, or tonight's, is about the executive summary. It's a 2-page document. Typically, I would argue you should strive to have all the key information on the first page. And it is a particularly useful tool for getting people up to speed on your business. If you can't describe what you're doing in a page or two, then you haven't thought through clearly enough what you're trying to do. Then, just for the sake of completeness, some other tools to communicate your plan, the pitch deck. And this is something that will evolve over, like all these documents actually, over the history of your company. 12 years later, after forming TeamSnap, I was still refining the pitch deck. This is the presentation that you show the various audiences that you want to communicate to about what you're doing. And then lastly, you'll hear, and this is kind of old school, some people talking about the need to create a business plan, which is really kind of a written form of the pitch deck. Over time, what I found is the pitch deck kind of is the business plan. There's an operating plan with financials and everything else that you use to run the business. But in terms of communicating the business, I don't think people read business plans. Once again, humans have a short attention span, and a 25, 30-page document is just kind of passé. And I myself have learned that if I can't communicate what I'm doing in a pitch deck, then I need to refine what I'm trying to do. Last thing that I'll say before I pass the baton to Kirsten and give you more details about the executive summary itself is just to say that your objective is not to tell people everything that you could possibly want to tell them about your business. All you want to do is get people interested. I'm using the expression here, set the hook. So that means whatever you put in your executive summary should be super concise. Ideally, from the first paragraph, you should grab people's attention. You ideally should be relatable. You should be understandable by your target audience. They should understand what you're up to. You should have a compelling story about yourself, about what you're trying to do, about why you're going to win compared to everybody else. You need, especially as you're starting off your career here, to convince people that you're qualified, that this audacious goal that you and your team are setting is achievable by you. And then lastly, and I can't overemphasize this, be excited. People feed off enthusiasm and positivity. And if you're going to set the hook, if you're going to convince people that they should take a serious look at your business, then in addition to everything I've said, you want people to like you. You want people to feel that you're excited about what you're doing, because if you're not, nobody else will be. Okay, time for you to take it over, Kirsten.
Perfect. Let's head on into the first slide. So just breaking down, what is this actually going to look like for you, and what are the requirements and the things that you should include? If just a really quick thing here, if you go to the NVC website, what you'll see is basically what I've highlighted in green, which is that you should include kind of a company description, overview, the problem you're solving, your solution to it, and then the evidence that you're gathering this semester, the research you're doing of the market research. And then on the second page, I have business plan. And then I've added a few things that I think are important and I've seen be really successful over the years in reviewing these. At the top, you'd be surprised how many people forget to put the name of their startup. So I highly recommend putting, maybe a logo or an image to just make it visually interesting, and then putting the name of your startup. And then I've got here a one-line description. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then this main section, they also include contact information. This is another thing that I see people kind of forget to include. Do we have a question from Amir?
Yes, yes. Thank you. So I just had a quick question. So in terms of the executive summary, so I know that we're using startup tree. So should this be in kind of the overview of our like profile for our business? Basically, is that where the executive summary goes, or is this outside of that?
I can take that question. So when you go to either the special competitions or for the NVC, you're going to upload a video pitch as well as your executive summary.
Okay, gotcha. So that's like okay, gotcha.
Yep. So the judges will look at that before they even see you in person.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan, for that. And then the other thing that NVC has asked you to include is a business plan. And so the way that I've thought about breaking this down is page 1, to Dave's point, should be the first impression. It's the hook. It's getting people really interested in what you're doing. And it should include enough information where somebody could only read that and walk away feeling like they understand what you're doing and feeling excited. And then hopefully they get excited enough to flip to the next page, which is where you might have some more information on your business plan. And I've added some things down here that you could include depending on the stage of your business, the type of your business. These are some of the things you might want to put. I'm not saying you'd put all of them, but business model, and I'm going to go into some detail on some of these in a little bit. Market size, go-to-market plan, competitive analysis, a little bit about the team, maybe some financial projections if you have them, or key metrics, the current status of the business, any accomplishments that you've made to date, or the timeline maybe for product development. And then if you are raising information, this is a great place to put information. Like we're doing NVC now, but hopefully, if you're looking to raise money and you want to use NVC as a platform to launch a business, then this is work that you're going to use over and over again. And so, there's no hurt in including that here, because again, at the end of this competition, if you go all the way, you could win a substantial amount of money. So sometimes it could be nice for the judges to see like, what would you use that money for? And what are some of the milestones you hope to achieve with those funds? So let's go into each one. So the first one here is that one line description. And we already had a nice overview of this from Dave, but I just wanted to reiterate, when I was at Techstars working with founders through the Techstars Accelerator, honestly, we would spend 80% of our time on the one line description and the overview blurb, because the rest of it, it's good to be concise with it and it's good to be, precise with it, but this is your chance at really grabbing somebody and helping them understand your business. And this can be really tricky depending on what kind of company that you're starting. So I have some prompts that I've found really, really useful. And what I would suggest you do is, as you fine tune your idea, use some of these prompts and just say whatever comes naturally after these words, right? So basically, in simple words, in a nutshell, you can also do an activity where you close your eyes and imagine what it looks like when your company is successful. Or what if there are ways to? By using some of these prompts, and maybe using all of them, you can come up with 5 or 6 different ways of describing your business. And that can be helpful in kind of narrowing down into the ultimate kind of one-line hook. One other thing here is just use simple words. What do I mean by that? Like no acronyms, try not to use buzzwords. Like if you're like, we're the best X, you kind of already failed. Like what is it that's really unique about your business and it's going to grab somebody's attention? So let me take you through an example. We can go to the next slide. So Flight Desk was a company I was a part of. I'm going to read this out loud really quick. Flight Desk is an operator of campus media platform intended to edit campaigns on the fly and manage the dashboard to empower campus advertising. The company's platform builds multi-channel campaigns and allows advertisers to reach students at scale across all on-campus media channels, including print, digital, social media, radio, and outdoor, enabling users to reach millennials in one interface and manage the full lifecycle advertising. Can anybody tell me what Flight Desk does after that description? Probably not, right? We've used a lot of different buzzwords in this description. It's far too long. There's a lot of details in here that don't help you really understand what we're doing. this is kind of where we started. We're just like, let's throw it all on the page. Let's go to the next slide.
I have a quick question about that last slide. So as you said, there are a lot of buzzwords in there and it's kind of long as well. But when we're writing like, say our elevator pitch or the overview blurb, is this something like that's more appropriate for those two matters, or do you also want to keep that simple as well?
You want to keep it simple, but you can go a layer deeper,
Okay.
right? And you're going to have it written. Right. So what we ended up doing for kind of the elevator pitch, or the one-line description is Flight Desk is technology that powers campus advertising. Flight Desk is the largest network of campus media in the US. Our platform makes it easy to buy at scale. Right. So you have just a clearer sense of what it is that we're doing, and if I'm critical on myself here, I would still probably try to get rid of like platform, network. Are there better ways to really describe what we're doing that help the average person understand what it is, right? I have a 4-year-old, so I get all kinds of questions. Like I'll be talking and recently she asked, what is liquidity, right? So by using words that she can understand, then that means that everybody can understand them. And you have limited attention spans. And so finding a way to describe what you're doing in a really simple way is actually extremely powerful. And then in the overview blurb, you can always, expand one more layer, add a little more information. So let's go into problem and opportunity. So this is part of what the MPC has asked you to address. And when you look at pitch decks, they're all going to include, what is the problem you're solving or what is the opportunity you're creating? And Guy Kawasaki is probably fairly famous at this point for his 10-slide pitch deck. You can Google that with his name. I think we have linked it in this presentation as well. That's a great place for some more information. But basically what he says is your goal is to change the pulse rate of the reader, right? And so, or of the person that you're speaking with. And so you're trying to get them to snap out of the million different thoughts that are going on in their head and just be like, oh, and really focus in on you when you're talking about this problem. And that only happens when you tell a story, right? So let's say I'm creating a platform or, let's say I'm going to create, actually, I've got some examples later on. So let me do the idea solution next, and then we'll go into some of the examples. So also kind of borrowing from Guy, the next thing to do is really describe your idea or your solution. And I think it's good to also include a little bit of information about the value proposition or the sort of magic that it brings. So, and to quote Guy here again, describe the technology, secret sauce, or magic behind your product. The less text, the more diagrams, schematics, and flowcharts, the better. If you have a prototype or demo, this is the time to transition it. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 pictures, right? So maybe you don't have a prototype yet, right? But maybe there's some way to create some visuals. And if not, you could still create visuals by, again, telling a story and bringing to life, the different aspects of your solution. So let's go through a couple of examples really quick. So Square. You guys are probably familiar with Square. This is from their 2014, I believe, Series A pitch deck, a couple of slides. Let's see how they do. So the Square proposition. First of all, what do I notice about this slide? There's a lot of text. It's a little bit busy, and I'm not exactly sure kind of where to draw my eye, right? So already I'm just a little bit not focused on what's happening here. But they're saying, huge market opportunity, mobile payments, inspiring experience management teams, solid business model. Like none of this is actually talking about the opportunity that's sat in front of them. Let's go to the next slide. The product. It's amazing to see some of these visuals. So designate amount, swipe credit card, enter tip and scan with finger on screen, transaction completed, right? This isn't actually the problem solution they ended up solving, but this is how they were telling it, 7 years ago. Let's go to the next slide. And then here's the value to the user: scan and go, intuitive interface, free card reader. This is how they started. And this is, I think, a little better and at least getting towards the value proposition. But we can see that even though they're including a lot of information here, they're not telling the story of what Square can ultimately do to a market and change the way that businesses and consumers interact. And they may not have had that full story yet either. So today's point, these things evolve over time. Let's look at one more example. So this is Front. This is a company you might not have heard of, but I think they do a great job, so I wanted to include it here. Email was never built for teams to collaborate. This probably resonates with you guys as students. I imagine working in a group project and just having to email back and forth. You have these long chains, who's in charge of what. The same issues happen in business. Next slide. So we built the first shared email client. It's like, okay, that's pretty simple. We've got a visual of what it could kind of look like. Next slide. And we rapidly broadened our value proposition. So they went multi-channel. It's individual yet collaborative. So they kind of showed you, here's the problem. Here's what we started with. And this was their Series B deck, right? So they're having to now take the first problem that they solved and expand it into, expand the feature set, expand the user base. And so this is kind of how they're showing that. So I think this is a great example of that problem solution in a company you might not necessarily know about, or a problem you've experienced personally, but I think they do a great job of showing that visually. The second thing, the third thing that the NVC asks you to include here is evidence of market research. And I've also put /traction, which is a way of showing progress that your business has made and communicating that to, a broader audience. And I put here, this is, I think, one of the most important elements. Having been a judge for the NVC before, this is one of the biggest things that judges are going to look for, because this is entirely in your control, right? This is showing us how much effort, time, focused energy have you put into this project, right? That's what we really care about. And, that's really the spirit of the New Venture Challenge, which is putting in time and effort and learning and evolving. So what can you show as evidence, maybe before you've launched the company or you have revenue? So the first thing I'll talk about is learnings. There's a lot of different ways you can learn, right? You can research online, you can talk to people, but what matters is what you do with the learnings, right? So let's say you've got this idea and you think maybe it could work in this market. And then after you do a bunch of research, you learn that actually that's not a good market for it. And so I'm going to pivot into a different market. This is absolutely something I would include in your executive summary, right? Anything that shows, the work you've been putting into this, and how that has changed or evolved your thinking over time. The next one is surveys, right? There's tons and tons of free survey tools out there, and you guys have access to great networks, especially if your idea resonates with students or with the Boulder community. This is a great way to collect a little bit of data. So you could include a line in there like, we surveyed 500 people and here's what we found. This is another great way to include some visuals, right? You can include bar graphs or pie graphs and put those and make the executive summary look nice. Subject matter experts. This is another way to do some research. And this shows that you're willing to kind of get outside of campus, or outside of your peer group and really dig into this, right? So you could say, I spoke with, this person in industry and here's what I learned, right? And running a business, this skill is so incredibly important. Running a business, it's the ability to get outside of the little box you get put in into the day-to-day and get some different perspective. Next one down here is customer insight. And then I put this as separate from surveys because you can also just go talk to customers. And this is like, if you could only do one thing, this is what I would do. Go talk to potential customers, tell them about your idea, and then just hear what they say, right? That can be so incredibly useful. And then of course, let's say you have a product that's in market and you've launched it. You could show user traction, user feedback, or even revenue if you're able to show revenue. Any questions on kind of these elements of page 1 before I go on to page 2?
Yeah, I have a quick question. So when you talked about learnings, and I mean, a few of these other points as well, you kind of talked about how we can start in one market and then realize that maybe there's a better market for us. And I'm not sure if I caught this right, but did you say to add like that little pivot into your exec summary? But because like the way I'm kind of thinking about it, if we want to keep it short and precise, wouldn't that just like be extra, not necessary?
I mean, if you've pivoted 4 times, I might not put 4 pivots in there, but maybe there's a really creative way to show a timeline of the company, right? So we launched the company. Here's what we thought we were going to do. And we did some research and then we changed it. You know, I think that is evidence of you working on this business, and it happens in real life. And investors, you know, in a real life situation will ask you, like, what's the founding story? That is my first question whenever I talk to a founder. What's the founding story? And I want all of that background, right? Because I want to know all the effort you've put into it.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
I put my question in chat, but I feel like what I'm hearing, because I'm a very visual person, is a pitch deck, not an executive summary. I think of executive summaries having a little bit more text, but what you're describing is putting a lot of visuals in, and it almost feels like a mini pitch deck presentation on paper with a bunch of visuals and very little text. Is that your recommendation?
Yeah, and Stan might have some thoughts here as the official NVC rep, but from a real world perspective and from the perspective of somebody who has judged this in the past, right? I'm going to be given the task of looking at 10 of these or more as I judge them. And if I can glean a lot of understanding from your business visually, that saves me time and it gets me more interested, right? When we just think about human nature. And I know there's limitations on kind of font size and all these different things. You kind of have to do your best within the limitations, but I would encourage creating a visual impact of the executive summary and doing what you can to make it visual. And I'm curious, Dan and Dave, please chime in there.
Yeah, I think a few visuals is critical. And I was actually talking to a founder of a young company today. And I said, one of the most important things you can do is establish a paradigm for the way people think, not only of your company, but of the ecosystem, of the market and industry in which you play. People, Susan, you're not alone. I'm like you, I think, in terms of pictures. But if you can come up with a couple of pictures that describe what you're doing, the part of the market you're focused on, and ideally how that's different than what other people have done, that is enormously powerful. And you know you've succeeded when people in the industry and the market start using your paradigm. He who establishes the model for the way people think about things wins to a significant extent. Yes, you have to execute, but you've already won a good portion of the battle by doing so.
I'll jump in real quick. The bottom line is you're telling your story, you know, as Kirsten has pointed out, and Dave, and so however best you can tell your story, and some of that is just your personal acumen, right? I mean, are you a visual learner and a storyteller with pictures, or are you a great writer? You know, lean on your strengths, and whatever's going to tell your story, that's what you use.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
I also, I also
go ahead.
have a quick question. So I would assume that all you guys kind of have made an executive summary at one point. And so would you share any resources that are really good for actually making these visual aids because I'm not the most artistic person myself. So I was just curious if you guys have any resources that you usually use to make these.
We've got some examples of things linked below, and then I've typically just used like PowerPoint or Word or Google Slides. You don't have to get, anything too fancy with these.
Yeah, I was going to respond to the question this way and say, I think you should sketch out something. As that's what I do. I try to, I think of it as getting my arms around where, my company or organization is playing. And, it can be very crude. And then you can find, you can use one of the tools that Kirsten was describing, PowerPoint or Google Slides or something like that, to actually take your sketch and make it look a bit more professional. But I've noticed I'm trying to come up to speed on Web 3.0 right now, and I'm seeing a lot of the literature include literally hand-drawn sketches
Okay.
to get the point across. So the idea matters more than the form.
All right, thank you.
And Mir, one easy way I found to make a pitch deck look cohesive is in PowerPoint in the top right corner. It has those little suggestions. And I like to use those just because it adds some structure to the actual slide, and it all looks cohesive because it'll suggest the same theme for the following slides.
Thank you, Sam.
Yep.
So I have a quick other question. So when we're talking about like visuals, I know it's very important for the pitch deck, but how important is it for the exec summary? I know that it's going to be a lot of words, and we might want to add like graphs or some sort of way to show evidence, like market research. But what would you say is visuals important for the exec summary? And if so, like how many? Like, yeah.
I'll take that one again. It comes down to what's best going to tell your story. I think the worst thing is, I got to put visuals in here, and the visuals don't tell your story. There's a disconnect, because then people get confused. So there's no right or wrong, like, you need to have 3 visuals or you have to have 4 graphs. It's really what's going to tell your story. I'm sorry there's not a more specific answer, but that's really what it comes down to.
No, that's a perfect answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's whip through some ideas for page 2, which might help with some of this too. So again, for business plan, you could include any of the following, right? So when you think about business model, that's probably text, right? Versus when you think about market size, maybe there's a way to show that visually. And so, think about the different components and what is the best way to describe each, and for your business it might be different than for somebody else's business as well. So it really goes back to, it's going to be unique for every company. And then I've got a couple ideas here as we kind of dive in to help with some of these sections. So if we go to the next slide. So the business model is one. I just included a few key questions that may be helpful for you to think about with your business. So how do you make money generally, right? Who's paying? Is there a difference between the person using the product versus the person paying for the product? How often are they paying for it? Is it one time? Are they paying once a month? How much are they paying? And does that match up with the user, the profile of that purchaser? What does it cost you each time? So what is the margin on that? Are there multiple different revenue streams, right? Different ways that you make money. And then the other thing that I think could be interesting for the New Mentor Challenge is, these questions to ask up front, which is like, how long does it take you to get to first revenue, right? Is this a consulting business where you can go and you just have to sell the service the first time and you can make a little bit of money? Versus, is this a technology product that you have to go build the technology first? So you might need money first before you can eventually make some money. And what does it cost you for the first one, right? To be able to sell the first unit of whatever you're doing. Again, if this is consulting, maybe it's just your time. Versus if this is a product, like a physical product, do you have to have it manufactured? And, how much time does that take and how much money does that cost? So these are all really useful questions to ask yourself in thinking about the business model, and great things to communicate on the executive summary. And we go to competitive analysis. Here, I just included a couple of ways that you could create or visualize some of the work that you've done on researching, who else is solving this same problem. So the one on the left is a table you guys have probably seen if you've been in a business school class, which is just showing your competitive set and how you differentiate on features. And then the other one is a market map, which in this particular example, this is about breakfast, expensive, inexpensive, slow and quick. So it's kind of a funny example. But these axes can be whatever you want, right? It could be expensive, inexpensive. You could keep that if it makes sense for your business. And it could be, like closed or open. There's lots of different ways to think about showing the competitive set. And the one really important tip here is you always want to appear in the upper right. You always want to be in that quadrant. So however you create the values of these axes, make sure it makes your company in the upper right, just because visually that looks nice. And then a next slide.
Yep, I'm having trouble with my system here. Hang on.
Oh, that's okay. And then again, with fundraising, right? Like if you participate in the NBC, you could win real money, and a lot of it, enough to really go and launch this business and start working on it. And so one thing that I see a lot in my work is this distinction between milestones and use of funds, right? So use of funds is like, I'm going to spend 20% on engineering and 30% on marketing. And while that's good, it's good to have a budget and a plan. That doesn't tell me where you want to get to with those funds, which I think is far more interesting, right? So what are the milestones you want to achieve? They could be user-based, they could be technology or product roadmap based, they could be revenue based, they could be fundraising based. But by establishing those first, then we can work back to what we have to spend to achieve those. And then we, like to add a little buffer maybe so that we don't run out of time to achieve those, because things always take longer than you anticipate. And then my final thing for this is I'm just put up just blurry in a lot of far away, like an executive summary that's all text and one that has a few visuals, right? Just to show you that the impact is different, right? Just the overall impression. You obviously feel drawn in to the one on the right. And something like this, like I love the idea of sketching it first and then making it in PowerPoint. This is not fancy. Do this for free. Don't spend a lot of time on it, but spend a little bit of time on it to show, the professionalism that you're bringing to this business. So Dave, back to you for our takeaways.
Okay, some key takeaways. First of all, the executive summary, as I mentioned, is a tool for explaining what you're doing. And it is part of a series of tools you can use to do so. So it's good to understand that you want to thread the needle between something that's really short, like an elevator pitch, and a full pitch deck. The idea here is a 2-page document. Ideally, in the first part of the first page, you're starting to grab people's attention. The challenge in this competition and in life, frankly, in starting a business is standing out from the crowd. Most companies don't succeed. Most companies don't even get funding. And if you're going to do so, you have to stand out from the crowd. I think it's important to make the point that this whole discussion this evening has been about how to approach making an executive summary. And we focused on lessons that are pretty general, but also some that are very NVC specific. And I restrained myself from making this point, but a lot of what you've heard tonight is not just about creating an executive summary. I'll give you one example. Kirsten talked about the value to the judges for the MVC competition, and also the value to potential investors in describing what you've learned, giving the audience some impression of what you've done to find out about the market and such. I was going to mention, and I'll mention it now. This is one of the major ways in which I see companies and organizations fall down. I can't tell you how many people I know, including some very intelligent folks who have had an idea, worked on it for a year, introduced a product, never spent any time with customers, and missed the boat entirely, wasted their time because they weren't developing something that people would pay for. So just in life, make sure, and this is easier today than it used to be, make sure that you take the time to talk to customers, to develop prototypes, to show people sketches and ideas of what you're doing, because that will save you time. It'll make sure that you're focusing on something valuable, and it is very credible to judges, to investors, and so forth. And I'll summarize the summary by just saying, if you take away just 3 things from what you heard tonight, I'd like them to be the following. First, everything you're doing in terms of creating this executive summary, and in fact, creating a business in the first place, is you want to stand out from the crowd. You don't want to do what everybody else is doing. You don't want people to not be able to tell the difference between what you're trying to do and your company from others in the competition. You want to stand out in a positive way from the rest of the competition. I also want to emphasize that you should look upon this as a learning opportunity. This is a phenomenal, the NVC competition that is a phenomenal opportunity to learn what it's like to try to start a business and how folks react to that and how you can succeed in actually getting rolling. And then lastly, look upon this as a fun thing. You should have fun doing this. It should not be a drag. It should not be drudgery. It should be an experience in which you learn a lot, you ideally meet some new people, and have fun. Okay, we've had a few questions during the course of our discussion here this evening. Are there any more?
I have a question that's slightly unrelated just because we signed up late. Have you guys already discussed about the video? Is there going to be a separate session on that?
So I'll go ahead and put a link to some of the criteria for what you're going to need to provide for the competitions. But the video is it's your pitch. So it's the exact same pitch that you would do for the judges. You're just going to videotape that and have that up there so that judges can preview your video pitch.
Thank you.
So I know I asked a lot of questions throughout the presentation, but I do have a few more. And one of them kind of talks about the problem and the solution. I know from like the last meeting we had with Stan, he kind of talked about it's very important to prove your problem, show that it actually exists, and kind of solidify the issue. And then you guys kind of went over that today as well. But my question is, in the exec summary, is it more important to really focus on the problem or solution, or 50-50, or like 60-40? What would you say? Or is it just like the same, whatever the best way to tell our story is?
I could take a shot at that. I would argue that if you cannot describe the problem in a sentence, you don't really know it very well. And you haven't figured out how to communicate that effectively. So it's super important, but the problem should be something that is immediately understandable and should resonate with a portion of your audience, not necessarily everybody, but a portion of your audience. To give you an example, I'll just use my own company, TeamSnap. And what I discovered is there was a portion of the world out there that had kids involved in sports and was dealing with the hassle of understanding the schedule, knowing where they had to be, when they had to be there, and so forth. So what I would typically do when I was talking about my company is just to ask, hey, who here has kids in sports? And how many people here are satisfied with the way things are communicated about your kid's sports team? And I would see people grimace. in the audience. Those are the people that I was trying to talk to because they immediately got the issue. Now, I'm giving an example of presenting the problem in the form of a question, which can be powerful. There are other ways to do it as well. And once again, it should be just a picture or a statement that people get, or a portion of your audience will get. And you have to recognize not everybody's necessarily going to have experienced the problem, but for your potential market, and ideally some of your investors will be in it, they should get immediately what you're talking about.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and I can add to that a little bit. I think it also depends on the company, because in some instances, the problem is very simple to grasp if somebody's experienced it, like with TeamSnap. And in other cases, it's actually the solution that's easier to grasp. So it really depends. Like, I'll give you two examples of companies I'm invested in. One is a carbon accounting platform. So to understand the problem there is fairly complex. And I could give it to you in a few sentences, but it needs a few sentences to really understand all the market dynamics. And then the solution is like, well, it's accounting for carbon, right? So we can do that pretty simply. Versus another company, which is a biomineralization company. The problem is that 20% of sealed fracking wells leak methane, right? Which is an environmental problem. And the solution is, more complicated, right? It's a scientific invention. So I need 4 lines there to properly describe the solution so that anybody, can understand it.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. I have a few other questions, but I don't want to take up all the time, so I'll let someone else ask.
So I just had a quick question about deadlines. There's a deadline, an earlier deadline if you want to participate in the subcategories. Is that correct?
So yes, the registration for the 3 special competitions, which is female founder, climate, or cross-campus collaboration, those 3 competitions, the registration opens February 1st, and then your executive summary and pitches are due February 21st.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
So my schedule makes it difficult for me to attend all these meetings, and especially for the entirety of the meetings. This is a question that you may have already answered, but it seems like you are recording this, and I would love to, go back and review these, these various meetings. So how can I have access to those?
Absolutely. So these will be posted on the website, and your cohorts will definitely let you know where the links are, as well as we'll send out a link via Startup Tree. Any other questions?
I'll go ahead and ask my second question then. So I've talked to a few mentors, and I think even talking with Stan yesterday, a big point when it comes to like the pitch is not necessarily going too in depth with the details and specifics of things. But when it comes to the exec paper, my question is, how in depth is too in depth, and how do you like really figure out that line when you're talking about your business plan? What do you want to really like? I know we talked about the points that you want to justify and show in your exec deck, but what would you say is like way too in depth that you don't necessarily need there?
You're going to be constrained by, you're talking about the executive summary here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, you're going to be constrained by the amount of space you've got. You don't want to use a font that's, like so small that people need a magnifying glass to read it. And that'll help. And I think we've touched on this during the course of the discussion, but in 2 pages, you should have a fairly complete description of your business at a more than just a high level. But I would argue that you should think about the executive summary in stages. The judges in the competition presumably will read through 2 pages, but people's opinions, and many people won't even get through the 2 pages. People's opinions are generally formed very quickly, like when we meet other people or when we read something. So that means the first paragraph is very important. And the rest of the first page is pretty important. And then the second page is kind of like, if you haven't already started to set the hook on the first page, the second page is superfluous. So that's the approach I would take. And then this is similar to doing your homework on the business, which is don't just create something in your dorm room or your apartment. Create something, have people look at it and give you feedback. And you'll, in my experiences, you'll get great feedback, and you will reach a point, and I'm sure this happened with a lot of companies that Kirsten worked with, that you'll start getting conflicting feedback. So if you're not careful, you just keep going in circles. And then you'll need to decide, okay, I'm going to listen to Dave about this, but Kirsten about that. You're going to need to exercise some judgment there. And you'll know when you reach that point. But I'm sure you'll get some great feedback if you just ask your buddies or mentors or anybody to comment. Do they get it? Do they understand it? Are you making your points clearly? I'm often asked most recently I was on a chairlift with some CU students, it turned out, that I didn't know. And when they found out I was an entrepreneur, they asked me, what advice can you give us? And my response was, the one piece of feedback I give people is nobody does it alone. So seek help at every stage of the way, and also seek to give help. Don't just be a taker. And it's a very rewarding experience, and you'll produce much more effectively as a result.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I'll just add on to that. Dave makes a great point. I used to teach writing, and I used to, when we did short stories, I used to tell people, have someone read your short story and then sit down with you and explain your story to you. And that's how you know if they got it, or at least if they got what you wanted them to get, right? If they can summarize it and be like, oh, your story was about, love. And you're like, no, actually it's about divorce. Then you know if you're making your point, right? So have them read it without you prompting, and then have them, explain what it is that you do.
Okay. And I guess my third question is literally about feedback. You guys talked a lot about like asking friends or mentors and colleagues, stuff like that. But are there any specific resources that you guys have used in your past to get that criticism, to get that advice? Maybe something at CU, maybe something out of CU. And yeah, just to fine tune these pitches and exec summaries.
I think Dave made the point, use everyone.
Okay.
There's no one that should not look at it, that
Sweet. Thank you.
You bet. All right. Well, hey, I want to thank Dave and Kirsten. You guys are rock stars. Thank you so much for helping out tonight. Yes, round of applause.
Pleasure.
And yes, again, this will be posted. So in the next couple of days, you look for that link, and reach out anytime if you have questions. Again, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, just one last thing there, Stan. Here are some additional resources that this presentation, or this whole discussion, is going to be recorded, so you can access these through that. But anyway, this will give you some thoughts about additional resources to find out more about executive summaries. You also see Kirsten and my contact information here, and books if you feel like getting into it, you can read, as well as podcasts.
And yes, the slide deck will be posted with the video.
Fabulous. Right. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.